I'm repeating again, please listen carefully. Jane Austen is dealing here with two entities called pride and prejudice, which are independent. But try to understand, initially she wrote this at first impression, and then later on, when she was denied when she was denied by the publisher not to publish, then she changed and she wrote it Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen is dealing here with two entities called pride and prejudice. Pride means garv, ankar, gaman. Prejudice means durbhavana, which are independent of each other and exist separately in personality and behavior of different characters. It would be it would, for example, be too simplistic to assume that Darcy embodies pride and Elizabeth prejudice. Darcy embodies pride and Elizabeth prejudice. It soon becomes clear from the text that prejudice is largely considered as a consequence of pride, reflected in the attitudes and behavior of both of the person who represents pride and of those who react to it. Pride shows itself in weaknesses, pomposity. Pride shows itself in weaknesses, pomposity, stupidity, snobbery, or eccentricity, which may make the character's behavior is look funny or ridiculous. It may also produce a sense of frivolity, which make it difficult for a character like Lydia to understand the consequences of her own actions and makes her insensitive to pain and suffering she causes others. So, my dear students, the characters, the text identifies and analyzes different forms of pride as they are revealed in the behavior of various characters, and different among them emerges more often than not as largely one of the degree. In some cases, however, a qualitative difference in the nature of pride is brought out. These different forms of pride are discussed in greater detail. It is important to remember here that the two such forms are explicitly distinguished from each other in rather pedantic definitions of pride and vanity, provided by Mary, according to whom pride relates more to our opinions of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of. For once, she might be held to be correct as far as events and revelations of characters in course of narrative appear to bear out her opinion that pride involves a sense, perhaps even an excessive sense, of self-esteem or self-regard. Still, the more important distinction working behind this difference is that while a sense of dignity and self-respect are substantially present in one form of pride, they are almost negligible in the other form of the pride. Darcy's excessive self-esteem is pride of this kind, while Wickham's self-regard is vanity. Pride is also manifested in varied ways by different characters. Thus, the distinction between the vanity of Mr. Collins and that of Sir William Lucas, or the vanity of Lady Catherine de Bourgh and that of Mrs. Bennet becomes differentiated because of the presence of absence of other qualities. In order to achieve a sharper focus on pride, certain characters are made to represent a quality opposite to it, so that they can be used for comparison and contrast. So while Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet represent different variants of pride, Bingley and Jane stand for modesty and candor. Bingley and Jane stand for modesty and candor, and the presence of the latter pair helps us in understanding the full meaning of pride in the case of former, between whom misunderstanding and prejudice delay the development of a relationship. The achievement of happiness in love. The achievement of happiness in love, therefore, becomes contingent upon the development of proper understanding of weaknesses originating in pride. If excessive self-regard is based on an external position, which is not a personal attainment but something acquired through a quirk of chance or fortune, pride takes the form of snobbery. Pride as selfless pervades the social environment in Pride and Prejudice. Insofar as people's attitudes towards each other depends on the benefit or gain they can derive from them. The most notable instance of this kind of pride is, of course, Wickham, but it is also present in the excessive importance given to petty convenience and the lack of interest in anything outside a narrow range of personal interest in characters like Mrs. Bennet, Lydia, and the two Bingley sisters. As excessive self esteem, which goes with a legitimate sense of dignity and independence of spirit, it is most notably present in Darcy. Although Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Bennet also possess it, pride in this form becomes almost a distorted or perverted expression of the dignity and integrity of the self. While both haughtiness and snobbery are shown to make people unsociable or cold and contemptuous, self centeredness and selfishness do not prevent them from being valuable and prone to gossip, and in the case of Wickham, even enticingly agreeable. Self esteem may make a character assertive like Elizabeth Bennet or eccentrically withdrawn like her father. Snobbery may make a character superstitiously non communicative like the Bingley sisters when they have to mix with people of inferior rank, or it may make them officiously patronizing, domineering, and rude like Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Pride in the form of vanity, which is often a combination of selfishness and self centeredness, can make a person pompous like Mr. Collins, fatuous like Sir William Lucas, giddily talkative and insensitive like Lydia, or fretful like Kitty. All these forms of pride are demonstrated both through dialogue and authorial comment. One main interest is, of course, is the pride of characters like Darcy and Elizabeth. Actually, curable distortions of a positive concern for integrity and independence of spirit. But this positive side of the self esteem can be viewed as a concern not fully covered by pride and will be discussed separately. When love is taken up as a theme of the novel, Jane Austen's treatment of the theme of Pride and Prejudice in the physical science, the structure of argument is raised on the basis of sensory data obtained either through experiments in the laboratory or information collected from reliable findings by the observer. So, the theme of this novel is also love and marriage. In Pride and Prejudice, we are shown the ways in which observation and subsequently communication become distorted by the pride of those involved in the process. The title Jane Austen gave to the first draft of the novel, The First Impressions. The title Jane Austen gave to the draft of the novel was First Impression. The title Jane Austen gave to the first draft of the novel was First Impressions. This may be a short questions or objective or MCQ question. The novel persistently brings to our notice the unreliability of first impressions, even those of intelligent and observant people like Elizabeth and Darcy. On account of his prejudice rooted in pride, Darcy manages to offend the ladies assemble at the Meryton ball by not paying them the attention that courtesy demands. Even Elizabeth is dismissed by him with a casual remark to the effect that she was tolerable but not attractive enough to make him want to dance with him. Elizabeth is dismissed by Darcy with a casual remark to the effect that she was tolerable but not attractive enough to make him want to dance with her. Elizabeth's hurt vanity similarly distorted her judgment of the characters of the Wickham as well as Darcy. Something she acknowledged later, saying, "How humiliating is this discovery! But vanity, not love, has been my folly." Pride is not an abstraction here, but a general notion which codifies a large area of human experience under a system of cognition and evaluation, which had been evolved by 18th century thinkers on behalf of a dominant social formation, playing an active role in the shaping the historical development of English society. So, theme of love and marriage, also there in this book. What are the themes of? Discuss briefly the theme of Pride and Prejudice. What are the salient features of the system of thought in the terms of which pride has been dealt with as theme in the Pride and Prejudice? So, Pride and Prejudice are picked out as the two of the text main themes. Pride and Prejudice are picked out as two of the text main themes and are considered with references to the humanist conception of character. These two themes are seen to open up with several others, especially those of love, theme of love, and theme of marriage. The themes are also considered in terms of the individual characters. Individuality is also there, identity is also there, in the portrayals of which they are constitutive factors. So the question may be asked, write a note on the theme of love and marriage, or write a note on theme of Pride and Prejudice, or justify the title of the novel Pride and Prejudice. So there is a social position of the women, education and accomplishment. My dear students, I would emphasize over here, if you go to the North India, you will find there the daughters are not given as significant or as important as the sons are given. The sons are given the milk, the ghee, dahi and all other paneer and other kind of things to eat. In those who are the non-vegetarian, they get chicken, mutton more or the better things. But the daughters are not being fed to that standard as the sons. Discrimination is there. So this book also attacks on that kind of discrimination. It wants the equality, liberty and the fraternity, theme of money and property, theme of marriage, theme of love. So a consideration of the social and economic realities of women in lives in Jane Austen's time is useful in understanding how far these enter the text of Pride and Prejudice. And it was not only in India, but even abroad. Women were extremely dependent on marriage and their education. Even if you just see some of our minority society communities, they don't send their daughters to the schools and the colleges. They get them early marriage. And they get married, there's no place to study. And Narendra Modi, Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. So this is also to develop the feminism, because he worshipped the mother goddess. He kept 9 days fast. And since he kept the 9 days fast, he worshipped the women. And worship the women is giving the power to the daughters and the women. Now somebody may say she left Jasoda Ben. But if she left Jasoda Ben, she has brought up the thousands of the women. He has brought up the thousands of the women. And in 1832, even the women's suffrages were there. A lot of slogans were there. But ultimately, nowadays, the situation is not the same as it was at the time in 18th and 19th century. So a consideration of the social and economic realities of women's life in Jane Austen's time is useful in understanding how far these enter the text of Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice. Even today, in some of the families, in the remote areas, in villages, that thing is still going on. If the sons are doing, that's fine. If the daughters go for that, that's wrong. So the Pride and Prejudice again is there. Even in Haryana, we find Khap Panchayat. If a daughter goes and wants to get married with somebody, then they kill the daughters in Haryana. The Khap Panchayat. But if the son is doing, that's okay, because it's the son. So there's no equality. So just to maintain equality, this kind of learning is very much required. Freedom is required. But they must have the social justice, the poetic justice, what is right and what is wrong. The right is right and the wrong is wrong. One must have the interaction. One must interact to the inner self. What I am, where I am, what I have to do, and how I have to do and how I have to reach to the top. All these thoughts should be there. And then understand the Pride and Prejudice in a true sense, not only the one aspect and taking and then started fighting at home and interacting or changing the complete strata or complete strategy of the family. You must have the poetic justice. You must justify what is right and what is wrong. Without justify, you should never come out. A consideration of the social and economic realities of women's lives in Jane Austen's time is useful in understanding how far these enter the text of Pride and Prejudice. Women were extremely dependent on marriage and their education aimed at preparing them for this role alone by teaching them skills considered to make them more attractive to men. And the same way here, the Mrs. Bennet, mother of Elizabeth and Jane, is inspiring, motivating the girls to get married to a wealthy man. They were also supposed to cultivate. कढ़ाई सीखो, बुनाई सीखो, कसीदाकारी करो. Even in Kamala Das also writing that in the book. Be Kamala, be Madhukutti, learn how to cook, learn how to weave, or learn how to decorate the house. But these very powerful, brave, bold, and women empowerment oriented writers denied. They had their own freedom and their own liberty and their own style of living life. Women were extremely dependent on marriage and their education aimed at preparing them for this role alone by teaching them skills considered to make them more attractive to men. We find even over here Tripura also. After 18 or 19 years, on the Facebook we find different kind of faces making different kind of things. Why? Because just to make them attractive to men. They are also supposed to cultivate to the same and an affected delicacy and helplessness, qualities regarded as feminine, and the loss of which was feared by many of the wake of books and movements that sought to change the state of things. Among the most influential of such books was Mary Wollstonecraft, a vindication of the rights of women. I'll be teaching you in 6th semester, which appeared toward the end of the century. So, my dear students, pay attention. A consideration of the social and economic realities of the women's lives in Jane Austen's time is useful in understanding how far these enter the text of Pride and Prejudice. Women were extremely dependent on marriage and their education aimed at preparing them for this role alone by teaching them skills considered to make them more attractive to men. They were also supposed to cultivate to the same and in effect and an affected delicacy and helplessness, qualities regarded as feminine, and the loss of which was feared by many in the wake of books and movements that sought to change the state of things. Among the most influential of such books was Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Right of Women, which appeared towards the end of the century. In your 6th paper, every work is almost for feminism and for the women empowerment. So the questions may be: identify the chief features of Jane Austen's treatment of love and marriage in Pride and Prejudice, or write a note on the theme of Pride and Prejudice, or does the theme of gender injustice become a part of Jane Austen's treatment of love and marriage, and if so, in what way? Write in detail. So, my dear students, the main characters: Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet, Jane Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, Lydia. Mr. Bennet is the father, Mrs. Bennet is the mother, Jane is the eldest sister, then Elizabeth, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. These are the 5 sisters, 5 daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. The Bingley, Caroline, Louisa Hurst, the Darcy, Lady Annie Darcy, Georgiana Wickham, Mr. Collins, Lady Catherine and her daughter Annie Deborah, the Lucasi, Sir William Lady Lucas, Charlotte Maria, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. So the novel is concerned with the tacitly accepted but not clearly formulated codes which determine people's choices in their interaction with one another. It is collective beliefs and convention which enables individuals to cast their desires and aspirations in patterns which have gained legitimacy through their continued practice in the community and have been approved by it. The use of wit and irony, this also may be asked in your question. Critical perspective. Jane Austen's work has traditionally been considered an important and formative part of the development of the realist novel, particularly the novel of social and domestic comedy in England. The work of T.W. Harding and Marvin Mudrick in 1940s and 50s together initiated the overthrow of the traditional view of Jane Austen's work, as charmingly initiated the overthrow of traditional view, ladylike, by setting out the look at the extent to which her use of irony incorporates a strong dislike and contempt, not just for the abstraction called society, but also for the individual foibles. Jane Austen's work has recently moved from seeing her as an upholder of the traditional to a writer who uses irony to subvert it. Three major strands of criticism are selected for an examination of how the concerns are relevant to study of Jane Austen. The first topic is feminist criticism. Involves interrogating the representation of women in the text, representation of the women, and ask whether that representation conforms to the patriarchal norm or not, and if it subverts that norm, in what ways it does so. Post colonialism provides a perspective on the relevance of studying Jane Austen in a context outside of the British, as well as looks at the presence, or rather the absence, of imperialism and colonialism in her fiction, asking what are the implications of such authorial choices as the restrictions of subject matter. Marxist thought analyzes the ideologies inherent in the portrayal of different social classes and of the nature of social change in the text, also taking into account the conditions of productions of the text. So, do you see the study of Jane Austen as relevant in the Indian context, and if so, in what ways?